Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Richard Navarro. I'm a professor of education and ethnic studies. This is my 27th year here at Cal Poly Pomona. And prior to coming to Cal Poly Pomona, I was the founding director of the Julian Samora Research Institute at Michigan State University.
Join us at the Grand Living Room on the third floor for the event, Los Tres Grandes, reclaiming historical legacies of Chicano pioneers. Learn about these groundbreaking pioneers who started new paths for Chicano leadership. Thank you.
There's the introduction. So anyway, and the Julian Samora Research Institute is celebrating its 35th anniversary this fall. I'd also like to express appreciation to the sponsor of this event, the Office of Interdisciplinary Ethnic Studies, Teaching and Scholarship, under the direction of Dr. Jose Aguilar Hernandez, and especially the wonderful assistance that we've received in making this event happen. Dr. Alvaro Huerta, Professor Dennis Lopez, Chris Doleta, Media Vision team. Thank you all and others for making this event possible. I want to welcome those of you who are on Zoom with us today, and I hope that you will be able to interact as well with our program here. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Carmen Samora. Dr. Samora has her bachelor's in fine arts from St. Mary's College and her master's of fine arts in Notre Dame University. She has her PhD in American Studies, Chicana Studies from the University of New Mexico. She's a professional artist, has created fabric, clay, and paper collages. She's a seamstress and a wonderful storyteller. So you're really open for a great treat today. And over the past 35 years, Carmen and Steve, her husband back there, have been great friends, cherished friends. So with that, I welcome Dr. Samora.
Thank you, Richard. I do feel very welcomed here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to read my remarks because then I can say more, can pack more in. And can everybody hear me? Okay, good. How do I capture the essence of Los Tres, Ernesto Galarza, Herman Gallegos, and Julian Samora? How do I convey not just the events of their lives, but the soul of their endeavors? How did they fuse their emotional, intellectual, and personal strengths to catapult themselves out of wretched poverty and into lives that were purposeful and dynamic? How could they come from so little to accomplish so much? I find their life stories endlessly fascinating. My thesis is that they each came to their life's work by the time they were 6 years old. They had some things in common. Each of the three came from desperate poverty. They had close relationships with their families. They each had spectacular mothers who were unstinting in their support of their sons, and they had raw good luck that they fashioned into opportunity. Within their relationships with their mothers, each grew up self-confident and purposeful. Even as children, they each made important contributions to their families. When Enriqueta Galarza was 9 months pregnant with her son Ernesto, she walked with her 2 younger brothers 20 miles up a steep mountain trail to reach her sister's home in a tiny village in the state of Nayarit, Mexico. Doña Enriqueta's parents had just died, her civil marriage had ended, and her sister's husband, Don Catarino, had agreed to take them in. Ernesto Galarza details the property settlement his father made at the time of his parents' divorce. Galarza's mother kept the gold wedding ring and her treadle sewing machine. Galarza assumes that his mother could have made her way with nothing, But with an infant to care for and 2 younger brothers, the wedding ring could be pawned in time of need, and the sewing machine was a means of making a living. Quote, even though I was something less than an infant, I had played an important part in the negotiations. As I see it, I earned my way from the start. Galarza was born August 15th, 1905, on the eve of the Mexican Revolution, into a family of peasant farmers in Jalcocotan, or Jalco, Nayarit, Mexico. His mother had one of the few books in town which she kept safe in a cedar box. Quote, his mother read it to him, opening his intellect to the printed word. Galarza gives us many details of his mother's teachings. Doña Enriqueta was the rock upon which Galarza built his life's foundation. It was she who taught her son about fairness and justice. He writes, Doña Enriqueta knew about people in deep trouble, for she was one of them. But unlike most of them, she believed in rebelling against it, in resisting those who caused it. It was from Doña Enriqueta that Galarza learned to question authority and trust his own judgment. Quote, Doña Enriqueta stood between us and Don Catarino when he was in one of his cantankerous moods. She drew a line between respect, which we were expected to show, and fear, which we were not. Throughout his life, Galarza employed his mother's techniques of resistance when he encountered structures of power. Doña Enriqueta's wisdom seemed boundless. Although her life was chaotic, she managed to create a space of safety and love for her son. This would have been difficult under any circumstances, but as the family left the shelter of village life to escape the pandemonium of the Mexican Revolution, her warmth surrounded Ernesto. As they traveled north on foot, by stagecoach, and by train, Galarza remembers that his mother created consistency in his young life. He writes, it was a gift my mother had, explaining things in such a way that our life seemed only to be taking a different shape, not coming apart. Wherever Mazatlan was, far away and unknown, our sewing machine would be there. It was like the feeling I had whenever the rainbow serape came out of the cedar box for an airing. We, the serape and I, had been together in Jalco. Even the smell of the cedar box was exactly the same in Tepic as it had been in Jalco. Because of his mother, the long and difficult migration from Mexico to Sacramento was an adventure and not a fearful episode for the young Galarza. Consistent with making Galarza safe, Doña Enriqueta taught her son how to conduct himself by learning the time-honored lessons of their Mexican culture. Learning these values gave Galarza self-confidence. Galarza describes the difference between an education, which is to know how to read, write, and count, and to be educado, which involved a more complex set of skills. An important aspect of Galarza's story is the growing independence he asserted as the family made its way to the United States. Noting that Galarza was a young child about 6 years old, it is remarkable how loose the tether was between mother and child. Doña Enriqueta created an environment in which Galarza, armed with the proper tools, could flex his intellectual muscles with self-assurance, a confidence that was critical as he tackled the agribusiness giants in the United States as an adult. His mother set up school, and while she sewed, Galarza learned to read and to count. Later, when they reached Sacramento, Doña Enriqueta continued her lessons by buying poetry and history books in Spanish. She helped Galarza read them until he was a fluent reader in Spanish. Once in Sacramento, Doña Enriqueta enrolled Ernesto in school, where he was fortunate to have a principal and a first-grade teacher who clearly knew how to help their students acculturate. Quote, and think of how wonderful it would be if all of our primary teachers were like this. At Lincoln, making us into Americans did not mean scrubbing away what made us originally foreign. It was easy for me to feel that becoming a proud American did not mean feeling ashamed of being a Mexican. In the barrio, even though they themselves were very poor, the Galarzas always helped out when they could. Quote, it was not charity or social welfare, but something my mother called asistencia, a helping hand given and received on trust. By the time Galarza entered third grade, he spoke English well enough to help translate for the community. Besides translating letters and documents for his neighbors, he read and translated articles from the newspapers about the effects of an illness, Spanish influenza, the pandemic, on the peoples in far-off cities and towns like in New York and in Texas. But all too soon, the stories had California bylines. And then Galarza's beloved mother, his tío Gustavo, succumbed to the disease. His mother had remarried and had had 3 more children. Galarza does not write about his stepfather. We do not even know his name. We do know, however, that within a month, Galarza had to bundle up all his belongings, including the colorful butterfly serape, and he and Tío Jose found a room to share. Galarza was 13 years old. Tío Jose provided food and shelter, but Galarza had to pay for books and clothes. Finding work on ranches and farms just outside of Sacramento, Galarza writes, I learned firsthand the chiseling techniques of the contractors. There was never any doubt about the contractor and his power over us. In one camp, children sickened and one had died from contaminated drinking water. Ernesto was appointed as the camp spokesman and he rode his bicycle, remember, he's 13, into town to report on the camp abuses. He found a man who promised to send in health inspectors. As Galarza remembers, I thanked him and thought the business of my visit was over, but Mr. Lubin did not break the handshake until he had said to me to tell the people in the camp to organize. Only by organizing, he told me, will they ever have decent places to live. Reporting back to the camp members, Galarza made his first organizing speech and lost his job. As an adult, Galarza organized farm workers and formed labor unions, every single one of them broken by agribusiness. Through congressional testimony and his book, Merchants of Labor, he brought down Public Law 78, also known as the Bracero Program. Set up during World War II to ease U.S. labor shortages, it became abusive of the Mexican nationals, also known as braceros. Finally, in 1964, long after the end of World War II, Galarza helped end the practice. It is not well known that these 2 factors, organizing farm laborers in the 1950s and bringing down the Bracero program in the 1960s, set the table for Cesar Chavez's later success. Agribusiness had brought in braceros to break strikes, and when the Mexican nationals were largely gone, Chavez was able to organize farm laborers. Galarza anticipated Cesar Chavez and what would become the United Farm Workers. Mr. Everett, a favorite junior high teacher, suggested Galarza attend high school and told him that college was even a possibility. Galarza indeed went to college, to Occidental. He was the first Mexican-American to earn a master's degree at Stanford University. He was the first Mexican-American to be accepted into graduate school at Columbia University. And he was the first Mexican-American to earn a PhD in both history and political science. In 1952, Galarza, in a letter to his sister, Nora Lawson, reflected on his life choices and honored his mother when he wrote, I don't know how many opportunities I've had to make money. Each time such a chance had come my way, my problem was whether I should take it so that I might be able to do something for those I love, sending you to college, for instance. But I have always resolved the conflict against the advantages to my family, and always because I could not see myself cutting myself off from the world that really bore me, my mother's world, and that of her people. The person Galarza became grew from his mother's strength, his investment in the cultural teaching she imparted, and his commitment to his community. Galarza's involvement in the founding of the Southwest Council of La Raza realized his belief in his gente. Ernesto Galarza died in June of 1984. Julian Samora was born the illegitimate son of an unmarried woman on March 1, 1920, into utter poverty in rural Colorado. In Pagosa Springs, Hispanos lived separately from the Anglos in all respects. Anglo-Americans viewed them as inferior, treated them as second-class citizens, and kept them on the margins of local life. People worshiped at the same church, but Anglo-Catholics received communion first, and then Hispanos lined up to receive the body of Christ. Hispanos went to the movie theater and saw the same shows as the Anglos, but from the restricted balcony assigned for their use. All of the town children went to the same school, but the Spanish surnamed first graders were diverted to the Mexican room. The children spent 2 years in first grade learning English, even if they already spoke English. The work that was available to Mexicans in Samora's village was limited to menial and manual labor. Men worked for the railroad, in the mines, for the Forest Service, or they herded sheep. The women worked as domestics. Very few Hispano adults had even an 8th grade education, and Samora's people were no exception. His mother had gotten only to the 3rd grade, and we know his grandmother did not go to school. As a boy, Samora never asked his mother why she had not married his father. Samora's early years were difficult because of the constant discrimination against his people, the utter poverty of his household, and the teasing and insults he endured because of his birth status. But his was a loving and supportive home. His grandmother, Celsa, was a curandera and partera and held some status in the community as a healer and midwife. His mother worked as a domestic. Both women were well respected in their community. Carmen, my grandmother, kept a scrapbook and a photo album. That scrapbook of my father's many academic and athletic accomplishments, which she assembled, is the material record of Carmen's support of her son. In it, she had glued each school report card, clippings from his sports successes, and the awards and ribbons from his academic efforts. His mother and grandmother had absolute faith in his future accomplishments and let him know of their love and support through their careful gathering and pasting. The scrapbook is a remarkable artifact. The very fact that it made its way to me, along with the photo album, reveals the regard the family held for both Carmen and her son. The family was so poor, my dad recalled, that they sometimes went hungry, yet there were resources to afford the album, glue, and scissors to track their boy's progress. Celsa and Carmen recognized Julian's potential, and they insisted that he attend high school. This was an obvious hardship for the women because they went without his full-time wages. He worked as the night clerk at the hotel, which his mother cleaned by day, and he studied during his shift. In summer, Samora worked with Tío Miguel, cutting trees for the Forest Service. He also helped his mother glean the fields for potatoes and carrots after the harvest. In an interview, Samora explained that he had had a sympathetic male teacher in the 8th grade. While Samora did not have a firm plan to become a college professor, he knew that he wanted an indoor job. Furthering his education seemed like a better way to forge a life than working at one of the manual labor jobs that he despised and for which he had no real talent. Samora saw that becoming a teacher was a way to help others, and he eventually pioneered a way to educate students traditionally excluded from colleges and universities. Samora had won a college scholarship, but he hesitated to take it. His mother was dying from metastatic breast cancer. He argued that he would get to college later. because he wanted to stay in Pagosa, work full-time, and care for his mother. Carmen would not hear of it. She stressed that he had earned his place in college. Her sister could care for her while Samora was away at school. And Samora then argued that the scholarship paid for books and tuition only. Where would he get travel money to come be with her? Right then and there, Carmen got up from her sick bed, pulled out the ironing board, and taught her son to press a shirt. She told him he could set up a little business. Carmen fully supported her son's engagement with higher education. One of my dad's favorite stories about himself was how he earned that travel money through his shirt business. In college, he was always very well dressed because after washing and ironing his classmates' shirts, Julian wore the shirt, then washed and ironed it again and gave it back. Carmen Samora died the summer after Julian's freshman year. His grandmother died the next summer, and Samora was orphaned at age 20. Carmen had supported her son's engagement with higher education. Without her unwavering encouragement and willingness to do without his earnings, even in her illness, Samora could not have left home to pursue college. Her sacrifice for him and her faith in him launched Julian Samora into public life. After graduation, my father married Betty Archuleta, my beautiful mother. My parents made a pact to do everything in their power to enable their other Mexican Americans to obtain an education. My mother, pregnant with their first child, even served as his chief investigator, interviewing people for Samora's research for his master's thesis. Together, he and his wife began a lifelong practice of helping other marginalized people achieve academic success. When Samora earned his degree in 1953, he became the first Mexican American to earn a PhD in sociology. Samora's dissertation, Subordinate Leadership in a Bicultural Community, investigated leadership relationships between Mexican Americans and Anglos. Why some Mexicans were allowed leadership roles and others were not, and how some Mexicanos treated their own leaders with suspicion if the leaders were perceived to be in the pockets of the Anglos. This understanding of the leadership conundrum between Mexicanos and Anglos guided Samora in planning for and establishing the Southwest Council of La Raza, which incorporated Mexican-American concerns at the institutional level. One of Samora's tactics in the graduate seminar he founded was to tell stories of his youth. He told of walking with a friend in first grade and learning one new English word every day, of winning the lead in the school play and having to give up the role because the other kids threatened to quit the production, of losing the class presidency senior year in college by one vote when his roommate failed to vote for him, saying, "Well, I couldn't vote for a Mexican," of being offered a room in a fifth-rate hotel only because the clerk thought Dad was from India. These stories revealed vulnerabilities and imparted to his students lessons of perseverance and tenacity. Rather than claim victimhood, Samora was claiming triumph. Samora enjoyed telling these recollections because he knew his students could relate so fully to his experiences and that they would find validation in them from their own personal knowledge. Samora completed his master's just after World War II and earned the PhD in 1953, just at the threshold of major civil rights changes in this country. When he came of age, Mexican Americans were categorized as white. In his middle years, the Movimiento Chicano joined the civil rights movement of the day. A few of his students complained that he was of the old guard and could not embrace the political activism of brown power. They failed to realize, because there was so little history written at the time, that by 1971, men and women like Samora had already been challenging the political and educational status quo for over 30 years. And people from the generation before Samora had not been silent either. Samora knew that Chicano power, while motivating, would leave no trace unless substantive institutional changes were in place. Samora viewed education as the cornerstone of change. Not only was education Samora's method for rising out of poverty, but he also offered it to others. 57 students accepted scholarships to the University of Notre Dame through his Mexican-American Graduate Studies program. 50 earned advanced degrees. He was able to capitalize on national changes to implement radical programs in education at the university level and to implement political civil rights policies at the national level. His role in the founding of the Southwest Council of La Raza emphasized his commitment to incorporate Mexican-American concerns at the institutional level. Samora told a newspaper reporter once when asked that no, he was not tired of the struggle, nor did he feel his work had been in vain. This reporter said, "Now that you're dying, do you feel your life's work has been in vain?" How rude. But my dad said, "I work from conviction, and rather than for results. And I have stood by my convictions." Samora developed a crippling terminal neurological illness, progressive supranuclear palsy. Julian Samora died February 2nd, 1996, on the 148th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the United States over half of Mexico. Very early in his life, Herman Gallegos was introduced to both governmental and private sector philanthropy, charity, as it was called in the 1930s. That influenced his later work as a philanthropist. Born into the Great Depression on June 25th, 1930, in Aguilar, Colorado, Gallegos remembers standing at age 6 in line with his mother to receive food packages from public assistance agencies. He would carry the packages home in his wagon, feeling the humiliation of needing the government handout. In 1939, when he was 9 years old, Gallegos lost his leg above the knee in a train accident. Gallegos had been resigned to a life on crutches, but then his school principal contacted the Crippled Children's Society. The society deemed him worthy of their help, and he was fitted with a $125 prosthetic, which they paid for and which his family would never have been able to afford. The prosthetic restored his dignity and mobility, enabling him to learn to roller skate, ride a bicycle, and eventually to drive a car. Quote, "In school, I managed to play with the other kids, and with the new prosthesis, I really forgot that I had any kind of disability. I recognized that there were other disabilities that one faces in life, and one experiences those through discrimination and exclusion." Even at that young age, Gallegos realized that the experience of discrimination could set one apart as if it were a kind of disability. The difference between the two experiences, one of humiliating public assistance and the other of restorative private sector charity, informed Gallegos's later work as one of the very first, and in some cases, the first Latino to serve on philanthropic and corporate boards. Gallegos spent a great deal of time alone with his mother as he recuperated from several leg surgeries. This led, he said, to a special bond and a relationship of confidence and trust with his mother that was sustaining for him. Gallegos recalled that when his older brother, Elmer Jr., was verbally assaulted by a clerk at the grocery where the family traded, Gallegos's mother came up with a way to respond to this incident of racial discrimination. Quote, "My mother said very quietly, 'We'll show them.' She instructed us to go a block and a half to another grocery store, but on the way back, we would carry our groceries in front of the store that insulted my brother. So I would take my turn limping up and down the street carrying groceries with the knowledge that what we were doing was a protest against something that wasn't right. My mother showed the power of a dignified approach to change that was an immensely important lesson for me. In the end, the wife of the store owner apologized to the family and offered Elmer Jr. a job at the store. Gallegos' father provided a different model for him. Always a hardworking breadwinner, Elmer Gallegos Sr. went to night school to learn welding and blueprint reading. This demonstrated to Gallegos how important education is to advance oneself. Through family and schooling, he formed the basis of his ideas about inclusion and equity, leadership development, mentoring, and development of marginalized communities. It was these ideas and ideals that empowered his participation in the formation of the Southwest Council of La Raza and his subsequent work with philanthropic boards. Dr. Gallegos and his people came from the other side of the mountains in Colorado, from where my mother and father were born. He described the hardships both sets of his grandparents faced in making a living on their ranches and selling their crops locally. The mining company, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, or the CFI, which was owned by J.D. Rockefeller, had become so powerful that it controlled the company towns down to who grew food for the company store and what the miners were allowed to buy. Gallegos detailed how his paternal grandmother, Madre Zulita, would enlist her sons to load up the wagon and sell various crops under a bridge at night to the miners. Had either seller or buyers been caught, they would all have suffered serious consequences, since the mining companies employed thugs and hired guns to enforce their restrictive policies. A defining event for his family was the Ludlow Massacre, which had occurred in spring 1914. The miners, in an effort to assert control over their lives, had begun a strike in September 1913 against the CFI, now the most powerful coal company in the Western United States. CFI Coal Company brutes fired into the tents that the striking families were living in. The Ludlow strike ended in a massacre when women and children were burned to death after the tents they were in caught on fire. As Gallegos writes, my parents never forgot what happened at Ludlow, and it was part of our family lore about the brutality of what took place there. As I grew up, stories about Ludlow remained very much in the forefront of discussions we would have about justice. When I got involved in helping to fight for justice for farm workers and other groups, my parents understood that I was well motivated by the fact that workers and common ordinary folks could end up doing extraordinary things by organizing themselves. One of the results of the strike and the negative publicity levied against John D. Rockefeller Jr. was his dramatic commitment to philanthropy through the Rockefeller Foundation. Although the foundation did not relieve the poverty endured by the miners in Colorado, it did serve to strengthen Rockefeller's social conscience. The Rockefeller Foundation would play a significant role in Herman Gallegos' adult life. Gallegos' paternal grandfather lost his ranch during the Great Depression because he was unable to pay the $16 property tax. Then, in 1936, because Herman's father had developed black lung disease working in the mines, the family moved to California. During college, Gallegos worked in a gasoline station to make ends meet. The station was located in an area known locally as Sal si puedes, get out if you can. Gallegos met Fred Ross, a protege of Saul Alinsky, the father of modern community organizing, and later he met and worked with Alinsky himself. Ross was working to help the community service organization, the CSO, launch itself in the Bay Area. Gallegos remembered Alinsky saying that real organizers have to go in and work with the people where they're at, not come from where you're at. Alinsky had developed certain essential community organizing tenets which Gallegos took to heart. Gallegos was elected president of the East San Jose CSO chapter in 1952, and Cesar Chavez was elected its first vice president. Gallegos worked as a social worker by day and knocked on doors in the evening, registering voters and taking the pulse of the neighborhoods. In this way, the issues were coming from the people themselves, and solutions would come from the people too, not from the top down. It was Gallegos who brought Los Tres together. Gallegos met Ernesto Galarza in California sometime in the early 1950s. Quote, as I began my organizing experience in 52, I'd already heard about Ernesto from Ross and Alinsky because they knew about Ernie and the work he was doing with the farm worker struggles. Along the way, we connected about the whole issue of the Bracero program. He had just a superb reputation long before I had actually worked with him. Gallegos met Julian Samora in 1962 in Washington, D.C. They found two areas of commonality. They were decidedly against Public Law 78, and each was a recipient of the John Hay Whitney Fellowship. What Gallegos brought to the table was a wealth of experience living and working with ethnically diverse peoples, from the miners of his early childhood to his school and work experiences in San Francisco. One cannot overemphasize the role that Gallegos played in opening the doors of foundation monies to Mexican Americans. Gallegos brought in Samora and Galarza, whose research-based information about the needs of Mexican Americans awoke the Ford Foundation in the early 1960s. Years later, after Gallegos had joined the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation as the only Latino, he was visiting his father in San Francisco. His dad asked him what was new in his life, and Gallegos answered that he had just joined the Rockefeller Foundation board. The what? Rockefeller? What are you doing with him? My dad just almost jumped off his seat. I said, I'm going to give away his money. Give away his money? Yes, that's what a foundation does. It gives away money. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. And from time to time at subsequent visits, when we'd be talking, he would ask me, how are you doing giving away Mr. Rockefeller's money? We want to be like them, these gigantes. We want to think that we can engage authoritarian power as Don Ernesto did, encourage the intellectual development of our youth like Samora did, and create whole cloth out of diverse elements like Don Herman does. And we can, and we do. Every day in our own ways, we follow their teachings and examples to make our corner of the world a little better than we found it. And we take every opportunity to mentor our youth because you are our legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samora. So we have about 10 minutes for question and answers, and then we're going to take a small break, and then we're going to continue on until 4 o'clock. But before we start that, I'd like to recognize that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And so I think that your talk was very timely, and it certainly raises our consciousness once again that discrimination is still, unfortunately, very, very strong in our society and in the world. So who would like to ask the first question or comment?
I'd like to ask my students to later today to Google Unidos US for their press release today. They made an announcement about the danger of the Texas SB4 law. And so one of the ways we can use the organization that these men created is to utilize the public policy analyses that they do, and that SB4 will essentially make people who look like me and some of you suspect for not belonging in not belonging in the state of Texas, so that local police and Texas troopers can approach someone that looks like me and some of you to compel proof that we're legally here in the United States. And if we don't have that, then they are empowered by the Texas state law to take us to the Mexican border. So it's bouncing back and forth between federal courts, federal appeal courts, and it was sent down from the Supreme Court. It might go back up, but the question is, should states, Texas in this instance, should states be allowed to deport people, which is not a power the states should have, but it passed. And so Unidos US has the analysis of that today in their press statement.
Oh, good. Thank you for mentioning that. And Arizona is ramping up too. Yeah. So, questions, comments? So you had told me that you didn't know of these people, and I was not surprised because we don't teach about them in our schools. So what do you think? What made them, because now you know a little bit about them, how they came from poverty and they were expected to work, and they did work, but somehow they got to school. What empowered them, do you think, to lift themselves up? What do you think? Yes.
Situations that they faced, such as having breast cancer, their mom, and then also having experiences that they had in discrimination. I think that's what helped them to be stronger and consistent into their goals.
Thank you. I think you're right. And what empowers you? How many here are first gen? Oh, a lot of you. Congratulations. What got you here? What can you tell me, you at the end? Why are you coming to school?
Graduate from college, and my mom didn't. My mom didn't even graduate from high school, and then my dad graduated from high school, and so I am actually first gen as well, and I'm doing it also for my family, and for myself too.
Well, congratulations. Yes.
I think for me, it's just like spreading awareness of things. I'm a first generation myself as well. My mom even told me, just because you're disabled, just because you're blind, you're not going to let nothing get to you. And I think for me, that's what inspired me to go to college and just to graduate next year too. So things like that.
Well, that's very good. I used to work at the Commission for the Blind in New Mexico, and I taught blind people how to sew on industrial sewing machines. So, and we made tote bags, and we had tote bags all over the world in the Army commissaries. And you had a question?
Oh no, I was gonna respond.
Yes.
But my mom wasn't even legal to be able to go to college, so the fact that I have the status to be able to go to college as a first gen is important to me, as well as none of my siblings have gone to college. So it's important for my family, for my mom, for my grandparents, as they didn't have the opportunities that I have now just for being legal here. So
Yes, good. Thank you for that. Because we have quite a disparity in our country between those who have papers and those who do not have papers. And now we're going to have to carry our birth certificates around, or we're going to get deported. You know, in the 1930s, the United States rounded up American citizens who were brown and sent them to Mexico, along with people who didn't have papers. And whole families were separated, or people who were US citizens came back when they were adults. It's a mess. What a mess. And we lose all of that brain power that we just send away.
Okay,
Yes.
we have a question from online.
Yes.
It's from, or it's a statement. It's from Isai Madrid. They say, "Thank you so much for sharing this. It really bothers me and disappoints me to learn about Los Ches Grandes this late in school. As an endangered species male of color in higher education, this is why I continued my education in urban planning, because gentlemen like Los Tres Grandes paved the way for Latino/Chicano for me."
Oh, thank you so much for writing in. That's, yes, it is. I think it's a crying shame that you haven't heard of these people. I mean, one of them was the precursor to Cesar Chavez, and you learned about Cesar Chavez in kindergarten, right? And you learn about him over and over and over and over. But he's not contextualized. You think that there are only 4 brown people who did anything in this country: Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Rosa Parks, and MLK. Those are the 4. And then if you learn of somebody else, you think, oh, well, that must be very unusual. And it isn't unusual. We have all this brain power, and people have been working and acting and creating new ideas, legislation, all kinds of things. And if you don't know about it, then you can't piggyback on it. You can't take their learning, like my dad's students who thought, well, you're an old timer, what do you know? Because they didn't know about the people who had been working since the turn of the last century. Yes.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on your earlier question about what compelled individuals and the men and women of our community from this period. The earlier generation of Mexican Americans, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, they were a very important catalyst of social activism too, with the lawsuits, the educational lawsuits and so forth. So I think, and as children, on your second question, I think as children of the Depression, it also compelled them to act because they were experiencing the large scale removal of Mexican-born immigrants. And so I think a combination, right, of generations. And as children of the Depression, they had no alternative but to act,
Yes. And what a shame that we lost those stories from, I would say maybe around the time of the Mexican Revolution, let's say 1910, people who came across for various reasons. Some were wealthy, some were poor, but they became citizens. And what about the people in 1848 who, when the border crossed us, that phrase, and they lost their land because they didn't speak English for the courts? All this brain power, big brain drain. And because you don't know the history, you can't work with it. You can't build. And that's what I think we as educators are trying to do, give you all that network so that you can build the next layer, because there is a foundation. If you only know of the 4 greats, and they're great, I'm not saying they're not great, but they're not the only greats. But if you only know of the 4 greats, you think, well, how do I stand a chance? Where's the foundation for me? Where's the net? Well, I'm telling you, the net is there. It's there. And your teachers will show you where it is, and then you find it. So it just aggravates me that we have this wealth of history, imagination, artistry, scientific knowledge, and every generation has to discover it all over again because we don't teach it in school. So stupid. So, yes. Thank you, Richard.
I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of the Zoom comment that I think it is really cool that we're learning about Los Tres, 'cause especially since it's true we don't really get to learn about people that look like us or people that kind of look like our uncles, aunts, or dads. And I feel like it just kind of motivates me and like those who look like los tres or just Latinos in general, that like we can do it too. And like it's kind of like, I don't know, just really motivating, especially since my major is fashion and I don't really get to learn about things like this. And I just came because it sounded interesting. So
you.
it's really cool to learn that there are people that look like us who were the foundation of bigger problems back then and that are still problems now.
Yes, and congratulations for being in fashion, because there's a place for you in fashion. I've been sewing since I was 5 years old, and being able to create something new, something different, something imaginative is part of my heritage. It's part of your heritage. So that's wonderful.
I just wanted to thank you for early on in your prepared remarks. You mentioned that these three, their destiny perhaps was shaped at the age 6 from their mothers. And I think that's a wonderful, powerful reminder to us all about the power of motherhood in the Latino Mexicano community. There is a book called Three Mothers by an African-American woman.
I've read it.
Yes, about the mother of Malcolm X, of James Baldwin, and of Martin Luther King. And so it's so important. The second quick point is that David Hayes Bautista's book, El Cinco de Mayo, An American Tradition, is a wonderful tie to history of the 1800s that I think I'd like to recommend. And then finally, there's a prolific, preeminent Afro-Mexicana scholar, forget her first name, but her last name is Lytel Hernandez, who wrote a book, Bad Mexicans, about what I think our colleague was mentioning about in the 20s and the 30s, the Mexicanos that came during the revolution and brought progressive ideas to the United States, and particularly to Mexicanos here and Latinos here in the United States in the 20s and the 30s. Kelly Lytle Hernandez is her name, from UCLA, a preeminent scholar.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a statement and a question from the Zoom. The first one is a statement from an anonymous attendee. They say, "We young folks are too busy wanting to become influencers of nothing too much. YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook. We need to open up a book and read serious talk." And then the next one is from Tara Yoso. Tara says, "Thank you so much for your amazing dissertation, reflecting on your experiences, knowing growing up, knowing Los Tres Grandes, how it shaped what you do, what drove you to be an educator, and in other aspects of your life's work. Are there specific consejos that you might share from them that you bring forward from their life's work?"
Yes, but first, to the anonymous commenter, used in a good way, the social media is how we can spread a lot of ideas. I mean, I don't use it because I'm old and I don't need to use it, but make it yours. Don't get sunk by it. And I didn't have any aspirations to have a PhD. I was working as an artist, and I was very happy with that. But then my dad came to live with us the last 18 months of his life, and we really started talking. And I didn't know him very well because he was always gone. You saw the lists of boards he was on and stuff he did and books he wrote. And so I got to know him. And then after he died, the University of Notre Dame asked me to come give a talk about him. And so I had to do a little research. And a friend of mine at UNM sent me to his archive at UT Austin. And I was expecting to find lots of good stuff in there. I was really shocked to find that my dad had been on the crest of the wave. He had initiated so many things. He was anything that happened in the second half of the 20th century that involved Latinos, he had a record of it in his archive. And I found that very humbling, that it helped me to feel like I was a part of the movimiento too, because our sacrifice as children of this workaholic meant something, and it was an important meaning. And in his archive, I found a couple of folders that had his children's names on it. And I called my brother that night and said, Dad loved us. He had a file on us. It was just so wonderful to see him as an adult, viewed from a perspective of an adult, not a little kid whose dad was never home. So when I started giving these talks, I wanted to start interviewing people. And as I did, as particularly the academics, I didn't have a PhD and they weren't taking me seriously. And I was a girl. I was really annoyed because I feel very strongly that had one of my brothers decided to write about Dad, so what if he didn't have a PhD? I had a terminal master's. So anyway, I got the PhD and a second master's, and then I started teaching, and I realized I've always been a teacher. When I was teaching sewing to the blind, I was teaching. And when I was in my sewing studio and helping women dress and shaping their garments, I was teaching. So being able to research these second half of the 20th century scholar activists, and not just these three, but others, women who were in the Carter administration, men who were in the Kennedy administration, starting in the early, like 1960, to build that foundation for myself of these people who had been working pretty much on my behalf. As I was educating myself, it became easier and easier to get that PhD. I was determined to get it. I was in my mid to late 50s, and I was 59 when I got the piece of paper, and I started teaching as an adjunct, and now I'm retired and 2 semesters into retirement. But I had something to say. I had their wisdom. Yes.
Okay, we have another one from the Zoom. This one's from David Garcia saying, thank you for sharing your research and experience. Do you know if anyone is working on individual books about either of the Los Tres? And if not, why do you think that is? Thank you.
I do know that somebody is working on a book about Ernesto Galarza. I'm working on a book of Los Tres, but it's a biography, but all 3 of them within the context of the founding of because the founding I see is something they all did together, and then they split off in different ways. And I and 2 colleagues wrote a book about my dad called Moving Beyond Borders. And it also involves some of his students who wrote chapters just about his teaching philosophy, the wisdom that he imparted, and, a biographical elements. And nobody's writing about Herman Gallegos except me. And I think it's because we don't know about them. I mean, there are many, many books about Cesar Chavez, but he never acted alone. He didn't act solo. All these other people deserve to be heard, And I'm also working on, but very slowly, a curriculum for high school and middle school about these guys and the women, just to, lessons, little short vignettes of what somebody did, and then a little lesson just to introduce people. Like one of the writers said, man, we didn't know about these people. And they're wonderful people. One person, Graciela Olivares, is the first woman to graduate from the Notre Dame Law School. She graduated in 1970. She's the first Latina to graduate from the Notre Dame Law School. And Notre Dame was all male at the time that she did that. And then towards the end of her life, and she was the highest ranking Latina in the Jimmy Carter administration. And at the end of her life, she had a Spanish language television station. It was the first in the country, and she sold it to Univision. And you've never heard of her. She died in Albuquerque. The Canal 41 is in Albuquerque. And when I asked my students in Albuquerque, they didn't know that. I went into Canal 41 and I asked, where's the picture of Graciela? Where's the little bio of your founder? Well, we don't know who she is. Ooh, we lose our history so fast. So, anything else?
Well, I think we're about at that time. So really thank you, Dr. Samora. Thank our audience here and on Zoom. Thank you for your questions and your comments as well. As far as consejos, I think that words like perseverance, tenacity, resistance really pop out. Just one short piece. When I was in the Julian Samora Research Institute, we did 40 hours of conversations with Dr. Samora and his contemporaries. And there was one exchange between Herman Gallegos and Don Julian about activism. And they said, passive behavior does not bring about change. Only action brings about change. And sometimes that requires nonviolent militant action. Strategies like boycotts and demonstrations to be able to bring about the change. So I think that those are wise words to end on, because we are, as Professor Lopez pointed out, we're in scary times, and times that are threatening to many people who look like us. We're privileged to be here today. We're privileged to be at this university. But think about how many that are being left behind because of the lack of opportunities. That's our responsibility. That's our need for activism. So thank you very much for your talk.
And I want to say thank you to those of you in Professor Lopez's class who stuck around. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being my audience today. And thank you for coming in.